and he's going to talk about what is a discovery. And I was talking to a couple of people who know Tony from way back and asked them what they think was his biggest discovery. So there was a really famous Nature paper that led to an in vitro assay to study microtubule dynamics, but they said it's a great assay, but they're not sure whether that really qualifies as a big discovery. And then Tony, of course, is really famous for the genome-wide RNAi screen, but again, it can be discussed whether that qualifies as a discovery. And one person said that they've never seen you as excited as in the last couple of years when you just started to go into the phase transition and liquid state, and phase changes. And maybe that is the biggest discovery from your career. Maybe you can comment on that.
Thank you. So obviously you have a whole set of talks from different people about what it means to set up a lab. And most of you are here, I think, postdocs who are thinking about going on to run a lab. And there's obviously a danger of being repetitive in terms of thinking about the nuts and bolts of how you get started or what it actually means to go through the next few months when you start a lab or the first year. So that's why I thought about something different, which is, why do we run a lab? What's the point of actually going and doing this difficult job? And of course, the reason is to make a discovery. We're all in this business to discover something. That has got a bit confused with the concept of building a career, especially recently, where these things have got rather tied together, where people, I feel too often mistake the issues of career and discovery. It's like publication. People sometimes feel disappointed if they don't get a paper into a top journal. But that's a different issue from whether the paper was a discovery or not. There's no bearing on each other. It's true that big discoveries tend to get into bigger journals, but quite often big discoveries don't get into big journals. We know some of the greatest discoveries, such as restriction enzymes, started off in very small journals in the current aspect of it. So therefore, what I wanted to come back again is think about this issue about, what is our goal as scientists? What is your goal as a group leader, and how are you going to get there? Because of course the question is, how do I make discoveries? You get a job, and suddenly there's a whole bunch of paperwork lands on the desk, and you've got to recruit students, and you've got to start supervising students. And people, and I see this so often, postdocs leaving my lab, other people come and get started here. In my job as a director, and also have been in EMBL of this kind of structure, I have almost unparalleled, I'd say, statistics on watching young groupers get going and seeing the pitfalls of it. And one of the major pitfalls is this issue of not being able to focus on the important thing, which is, how is my lab going to make an important discovery? Because one spends too much time on the details of getting the lab started. In other words, a classic problem of tactics versus strategy. What do I do? What do I say to group leaders when they come to the institute? When I sit down with them and I discuss. Can we close the door? Actually, it's a bit loud of the canteen out there. So what do I say to group leaders when they come into the lab? How to get started? Now, the first thing I say to them, you've got to keep working in the lab. And I think this is the very first thing about making discoveries, is you yourself have to carry on working in the lab. That's the major mistake that happens at the beginning. People come in and they become what Ted Sandlin termed a CEO scientist. Which is sitting in the lab, trying to recruit as many people as possible, trying to get them to do as much work as possible. And often it doesn't work. Why is that? I see my group leader in the office. Generally when postdocs leave, probably the last thing they feel when they leave the lab is, thank God I can get away from this schmuck who's sitting in the office taking all my discoveries and talking about them. Now I can actually get in and do my own stuff. What does he do anyway, or she? He just sits in the office looking at his computer and waiting for discoveries to come in that he can talk about. But then of course what you discover suddenly when you start a lab, and I have so many conversations with starting group leaders, because of course it's the personnel issue. How do you deal with all the personnel coming to your lab? And what you realize, someone like me, well, I do have experience in, of course, is running lots of people. That's what I've learned And that's what everybody learns in their time is actually running a lab. And so, therefore, I think the beginning strategy has to be to stay lean and small and working in your lab at the same time. Now, why is that? What you're trying to do when you come to a lab is you have to do two things, or three things really. You have to get started quickly, you have to develop short-term momentum, and you have to develop a long-term strategy of where you want to go. Short-term, the most important thing you can do in your lab is to publish a paper as soon as possible. That's what I always recommend. Pick some small issue that you had discovered in your previous lab, even if it's with your boss, ex-boss, and get it published. And why is that? There's a number of things that are really powerful about that. First, it gets your lab on the map. Aha, person X, last author, new address, they've moved to so-and-so, because most people don't know you've even left where you did your postdoc. So that's a great thing about a short-term discovery, which is a small paper somewhere where you get it out there. The second thing you do is you generate a good psychology in the lab, which is people now think, student X or whoever got a paper, I can do that. And then you generate this feeling of, yeah, this can happen. This I can do it too. Because there's nothing worse than watching the postdoc next to you struggle for 3 years to get a paper in, for depressing yourself, especially a young student. And that's why I often think that people make a big mistake at the beginning of trying to get their paper, which is really just a follow-up from their postdoc work, into a high-profile journal like Cell or wherever Nature Science. They invest a lot of time in something that has no bearing whatsoever on their career, because everybody knows it belongs to the previous guy to a certain extent, and has no bearing on discovery because it's the past. So that's what you really want to aim for, is to be getting out a paper at the beginning to say, yeah, this is me. But then, of course, you also have to get a sort of medium-term strategy going of the work that you did from your postdoc, maybe sort of getting a few projects running along, so actually there are projects happening in the lab and things that you feel comfortable with. And that's what I call a medium strategy. But to make a discovery, what you have to do is you have to develop a long-term strategy. Where do I want to go? That's what I often ask people, say, when they come in here to the interviews for group leaders, short talks. I say, in 10 years' time, where do you want to be? You want to be known as, say, Yusuke Toyoda is known for X. Oh yeah, Toyota, he did X. That's what you want to be known for. And how do you get there to be such to actually do that? And that's really the crucial thing. Now, in order to do that, you have to pick a project which is new. The biggest mistake that most starting groupers make is picking projects which are the same as the seniors. Could be your postdoc advisor, could be someone else in the field, because no matter how much you try, it's always extremely hard to compete with the seniors. They have big labs, they have lots of money, they get invited to all the meetings, they review all the papers. I mean, the cards are completely stacked against you as an up-and-coming scientist trying to do similar projects to the seniors. And that's why you have to think about what kind of direction can I take that will take me out of that mode and into the mode where I have freedom of my own to make a discovery. The reason that I talk about short-term, medium, and long-term is exactly due to the introduction. You can look at my career and say, what discoveries did he make as a group leader? And I'll give you an example of that. And I'm going to illustrate my career to let you a few things to get from that. One, you have to constantly be searching for a discovery that you want to make. You have to be constantly dissatisfied with what you've done. And you have to build that culture in your lab of people not feeling self-satisfied, but unsatisfied with what they've done. So if you look at my career, I was a very successful postdoc. I came to Embl, and I also did the same thing. I taking advice of a mentor of mine, I did what I told you, is I published a short paper when I first got there in Embo Journal of phosphatases in Xenopus, and that sort of got the lab on the map. Then, what I did is I started working with Eric Carcenti on spindle assembly, Xenopus extracts, and we made a very important discovery. So that was one of the most important discoveries I have ever been part of, which is we showed that you can make a spindle simply by coating beads with DNA. You didn't need centrosomes, you didn't need kinetochores. These spindles were self-assembled simply by putting the DNA in the extract. It sent shockwaves through the whole community at that time. It was so ahead of its time that only now people are still working on that problem. And then I was very excited about it too, of course, and I started thinking of to work on that, and this would be a great thing for my career. Here's a new thing I've got going. But the more I realized that discovery in the end would never belong to me. It would belong to Eric. Eric was the senior scientist. He was the one who had built his whole career on this problem. It's true I came in with a whole bunch of new techniques, which I was able to use to get it working. That probably would never have happened if I hadn't have been there, because I brought all these techniques on xenophus extracts from San Francisco to Dresden, to Heidelberg at the time, sorry. And I, as a young scientist, was 30 or something at the time, I was super excited of my own role, and at the time thought, but the more I thought about it and the whole issue, the more I realized I couldn't be satisfied with that. I had to get on and do something myself. How would I branch out from that? So don't forget, this is me. I've done my PhD in 3 years. I've done a very successful postdoc for 5 years. I've been in the lab for 2 or 3 years, my own lab. I've done this thing, but still I'm thinking to myself, what discovery are you going to make? What are you actually going to do with your career? So then what happened was C. elegans RNAi was discovered. And I thought, that's it. I read this paper. I walked down the river with my mentor, Tim Hitchison, who was just visiting at that time. And I came back to the lab and I said, okay guys, that's it. Everybody's stopping now, we're going to do RNAi in C. elegans. And I switched the whole lab over to doing that. So the lesson of that particular change is you've got to gamble. Right? If you're going to be successful, you've got to gamble. There's no point being, sorry? Safe is a good word. Safe or
conservative.
Risk averse, thank you. Yeah, no point being risk averse.
Gambling is also a way to lose.
Sorry?
Gambling is also a way to lose.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm not talking about gambling. If you think of any person who's done anything great in life, from a motor racer to a football club to a general in a battle, they always have to take risks. You're not going to win unless you take a risk. And by winning, you're not going to do anything important unless you take the risk and say, I've got to put all my cards in this basket. See, that's what we've got to do eventually. So, and of course, that's why I was saying, don't forget, I haven't started my lab now. What I've done is the lab's already got going and I've got a few papers. So I've got the momentum going in my lab. I've got my own lab. Tony Hyman was invited to give talks. But I've got a bit stuck. And so therefore I'm going to get out there and think of something else to do. And as I said, in that case, I came in and I thought and it wasn't really a gamble because after all, RNAi worked. I knew I would get mutants and genes out of it. And so I thought, let's go down that route. But then, that was the whole time of cataloging. And I thought, and for a long time we worked on the catalog with RNAi screening, we made GFP proteins. And that was an awful long time where we didn't really make any important discoveries. And so that's the other thing to remember about being a scientist and how to make a discovery. It's a long-term business, a very long-term business. So you could say that from the time I started RNAi screening till recently, it was like more than 10 years. We did a lot of good, important science. We published a lot of great papers. But did we make a discovery? And then, as it's brought up, when we finally found out that these liquid-like states of cytoplasm, that's definitely a discovery. I can feel that when I give talks. People are responding to that in a way that people respond when there's something important that's been done. And so, how old am I now? 50, right? So I started when I was 30, so it's a 20-year process to make a discovery. So if you come back and think about my lab, how am I going to set my lab up then in order to be sure that I can stay, that I can come in the end to get flexible? What you've got to do right from the beginning is you have to generate a culture of discovery. Because starting a lab is a time where you really understand building a culture. Culture is easy to generate and very hard to change. This institute is a classic example for me, where I started the institute, And now there are many things that I'd like to change, such as the Thursday seminar time. I always bring this up. The Thursday seminars are 4. I've been pushing my colleagues to change to 11 for a long time, because I think 4 is a stupid time. Every time I go elsewhere in the world now, it's also moving to 11 because people come from America, they're jet lagged, it's just a terrible time to be talking. Even if you look at circadian rhythms, it drops off. Can I get that changed? I can't. You know, I battle with my colleagues. It's always been at 4, blah, blah, blah. But I was there when the decision was made. It took all of about 30 seconds. And that's exactly what happens when you start your own lab. The culture that you set up at the beginning will be the culture that carries through your lab throughout its whole time when you're there. As an example, organization. If your lab's not organized at the beginning, it'll never be organized. Some aspects of my lab that I organized were at the beginning, such as the strain collections, are well organized still. But the things I didn't do are still not organized, and there's no chance of changing it. I see that. Every new generation of postdocs comes in, I try, but they take the culture from the previous generation, and we should all have our own stuff, and it's just impossible to change it. I'd have to fire the whole lab, start again with a new set of people, and then have a whole thing to do it. So anyway, so that's, I think the thing is the culture, and that's why I say at the beginning, one of the most important things is to work in your own lab. If you don't work in, that's what Kai Siemens told me when I started. If you don't do experiments in your own lab, who's going to set the standards? Who's going to set the standard what a good Western blot should look like? Or a good microscopy? Who's going to set the standards? Who's going to use a microscope and shout because someone's got oil on it or something, or the mask heat's no good? You're the only one. When you start your lab, you're not going to have hotshot people from all over the world because they don't come to starting labs. You'll have a few students who are very experienced, maybe a postdoc if you're lucky, and the only way that they will learn what it means to get a good result and what that means is if you yourself are working in the lab at the same time. So that's the crucial thing. And I see that mistake over and over and over again. People get in the lab, finally, I don't have to do any more. No more late nights, I can stay in my office. They say in the office and they're getting nervous because there's not enough results coming at the beginning because the students are all too inexperienced. At the beginning, they themselves could have done more work than the whole lab put together because at the end of it, you're super good at doing experiments. And I remember when I started my lab at Heidelberg and I worked in the lab thinking, God, I wish I'd been this way. Even starting a postdoc, I was really efficient. Experiments worked, I could do them very quickly. And so I think by staying in the lab, you A, use the expertise that you have, B, you stop bothering people in the lab, and C, you're much happier. It's definitely a recipe for unhappiness. Is to sit in the office and worry about safety or whatever, or some safety issues or somewhat ordering stuff or this or worrying about the latest paper coming in. And people get very, very nervous starting labs. You'll see that's a classic problem of young group leaders. They're very nervous. And that, in my opinion, is partly because they're not doing any work in the lab any longer. They sort of suddenly change their whole things, the sort of structures of what they're doing. And so I think that's one of the other things. First thing, you have to work in the lab. The second thing you need to do is you need to make sure the lab understands your vision. I can't say I'm always great at that, but the more the lab understands your vision, the better it is. So I always give a talk in this interview on how to write a paper, but that's just a sort of code for thinking about how to do a PhD. And the first thing I always say is, what's your question? You've got to know what the question is. And then I always come up after that talk and see various students closeted immediately with their supervisor in the office. Because they don't know what the question is. I see that over and over again. And so that's the important thing, is you have to make sure that everybody in your lab understands not only what their project is, but as much as possible the overarching goal. Where are you trying to go? And in that aspect, as much as possible, they can try and get involved in the whole of the science. So I think that's the other crucial thing, is to take enough time to talk to people so that they know what they want. And that's, I think, what you have to do most of as a group, besides working in a lab, is talk to people. You have to talk all the time to people in the lab, not just in official meetings, but in the corridor, because only there do you get emotional reactions, which really say what someone's really thinking.
Can you go into a bit more detail about how to do that? Because we all have different opinions about what the right experiment is to do next, for example. So you have to be strict in a way, or
About what? Sorry, about specifically
About getting your workers to understand your vision.
Well, what I'm talking about here is there's the nuts and bolts issue of sitting down with them and saying, this Western blot is rubbish, you have to do it again. Right? That's one thing you can do, the nuts and bolts of it. And that's something, probably many people talk about that, but that's, the business starting a lab. I'm talking more about the issue about just trying to get a dialogue going with people in your lab. That's what I'm talking more generally here, is that everybody in the lab, you have to be able to have a dialogue with them so that you can appreciate them. And people often ask me, how do you select people to come to the lab? What I do, and everyone in my lab knows that, the first night I go out to dinner with the postdoc applicant and we have dinner together. And why do we do that? Because I've got to know I can talk to this person. If I can't talk to this person, it's 0 point in coming to the lab. Doesn't matter how smart they are, because I'll never want to talk to them. And then their lab and their postdoc will not be a success if they can't talk to me, because by definition I won't want to invest any time into it. So I think that's the point. You have to get that dialogue, and by developing that dialogue with people, you can then start to communicate your message. Not just experiments, but the long conversations in evenings or Saturday morning or whatever you have to meet them, where you actually talk about science, so they can really get a feeling of what is it that we're interested in and what problems are we trying to actually get at. So those are the things so working in the lab and getting the culture of discovery in terms of talking to people and making them understand why you're doing certain things. What people are often confused about in the lab is, why is it that my supervisor did something? Why did they start a collaboration with this person? Why are we doing this technique? Why is it that I didn't get put on this project, etc.? And that is what leads to the biggest problem in labs, is people's lack of understanding of why the decisions you made happened. Why is it that you made those decisions lead to mistrust and lack of understanding of what the problem is? Everybody understands that things are difficult, there's no right and wrong, there's multiple different ways to do things, but if people understand why you did it, there's a massive amount of capital income in the lab. So that's one thing. So, because what are you trying to do in the lab? What is your job as a group leader? Your job as a group leader is to give a sense of excitement to the people in the lab and a sense of protection so they can get on with doing something important. And you're trying to create a culture of creativity. So that, it's coming back to this issue about how you make a discovery. You make a discovery by being creative. You have to think outside the box. There's no point having a lab of 8 people and you being the only creative driver. That's no help whatsoever. The whole point about running a lab is not to have 8 people to run Western blots. It's to have 8 people to think. It's to build up a way of thinking with all those people in your lab, that they all together can help to do it. So then you have to think, how am I going to go about setting up a culture that people want to think, that they're not afraid to think, they're not afraid to try different stuff. That's tricky. It's very tricky. If you read any management magazines and about big companies, they're always talking about that. How do you keep a company going? How does Apple keep creative, innovating? Same with the lab. How does the lab keep innovating? And how does it stay creative? So your job as a group leader is to make people feel safe. Safe. You have to give them the feeling, it's like, even if you're really being scooped and it's really a bad scene, you don't want to communicate that to your lab. That's not your job. It's like as a parent, right? If you've lost your job and it's bad, you don't communicate that to your kids. Oh, it's all fine. We'll find a way to go on vacation. Don't worry. That's like my dad said to me as an example. I mean, he lost his job, but I never felt worried about it because he just gave us the feeling we're going to be fine. And so I think that's true in the lab. And you make people feel safe. It's not allowed to go and communicate your anxieties and worries to your lab. You go and do that to your friends or your colleagues. But your lab should feel safe in that situation. So then you create a safe environment. And then you've got to generate trust. You've got to generate trust with the people in the lab, that you are thinking of them, that they feel that in the end, when push comes to shove, you will look after them. So that's the kind of trust issue. And then once you've got a trust issue going, and that's, because if you don't have any trust, then people start to do their own thing. They don't go with the group any longer. They're upset, and then it all begins to permeate into the lab. And everybody knows here, when you feel stressed, you don't think properly. And we all know that, right? You can't remember the name of somebody, you feel stressed, or whatever. I mean, your brain doesn't work properly under stress conditions. So you want to have a nice calm atmosphere. Then you want to generate creativity. And how do you get people to think creatively, trust what they think, and bring it to you for discussion? Obviously, that's a multifaceted business. But the first thing you have to do is you have to give people freedom. You know, if people think that all the time you're on top of them every day, it creates a culture where they don't think. You know, you yourself are much better at thinking than your people in your lab at the beginning because you've got much more experience. You know, you bring things to mind much quicker because you spend more time making associations. And that can often lead to people not being confident about thinking. So you have to give people time on their own. So the mistake that many groupers make when they start their lab is to have the student in the office every evening and looking at the gels and the Western blots and talking about it. They have no time. You have to give them the time to think. So the strategy I tend to take with that is to spend a lot of time at the beginning if possible talking about the project. And of course, by the way, last one to say I'm perfect. You know, all the things I'm saying, I'm sure anyone in the lab can point out that I'm not doing. But as I was always told, do as I say, not as I do. So, you know, but what I try and do is when students come to the lab, as much as possible, make sure that they have a project to get started on, and spend some time, also with postdocs, you know, spend some time with them so we really understand together. We have an agreed sort of plan about what the real project is, talking about that. But then eventually the talking should be done, and the science and the work should get started. And when people are actually working on the projects, try and leave them alone as much as possible to get on with it. It can't always be true. There are competitive situations or things where it has to go faster. But mainly in situations like that, you want to give people a chance then to think. So now they're thinking. So then how do you get them to think to you or the lab? How do you get that to come back again so that they actually start to talk about it? You know, and for those who've had children, it's a very similar process, which is the first time a student comes into you with a good idea, it doesn't matter how stupid it is, you say it's good. You know, I know that's rocket science, but the first time someone comes in with, what about this idea? And you say, that's terrible. They'll never come to you with an idea again. You know, and then let them go off and mess around with that idea for a little bit. And then after a while, it didn't work, you know. So you can't, what you're not doing in this process is you're not forgetting about them. Again, it's like having children. You know, when a baby goes off, and a young child toddles off and wanders around thinking they're free, you know, the parents are watching very carefully. You know, it's just like, I went back to my dad once to his boarding school. It's really bizarre. I remember this as much as possible. We were wandering around at evening, at about 9 o'clock in the evening, he said, and the matron said, stop, shh. We went behind this pillar, and all these children were scuttling across the kitchen to try and steal some food. Come back again. My dad said, God, you know, we always did that. You know, thought we were getting away with it. But of course, the matron knew exactly what the children were doing. But, you know, developing a sense of, you know, sort of independence, so that they could do the thing, but under, you know, Aufsicht, as the Germans say. So I think, you know, you're not forgetting that. You know what they're doing. You have an idea in your mind, that should have been done by this time, this project. And you have to go and try and catch them down and see what's going on and try and sort it out. So within that, you then have to let people have some ideas and let them have a go and fail. You know, you have to fail to be successful. You have to be through failure, and they have to know what it means. Plus, as a senior person, you often get it wrong. You know, just because you have the idea it's not right, maybe you're wrong. So that, again, is the crucial thing, which is to let people have enough freedom that they can go on and be creative. And then will come this great moment where someone comes into your office and suggests an idea, a really good idea, you never thought about yourself. Such a fantastic moment. And then you know that you're really succeeding in running a lab, because you're you're making a creative atmosphere where people feel safe and able to succeed, and they're beginning to bring the whole thing. And one of my main criticisms of many of my colleagues is they spend too much time talking to people in the lab. You know, I like to chat to one of those in the lab, but getting them in the office and really talking about the data is inhibitory. It's inhibitory to creativity, because you're not giving anyone the self-confidence that they themselves can go off and do it on their own. So I think that's that's the crucial thing from the beginning, is then coming back to the nuts and bolts of it. You're going to start your lab, you're going to have your money, you have your space, and it's like nesting, right? The male bird normally sets up a nest. It can be a female bird too, and Ivan set up a nest, and then try and get other birds to come along and mate. And that's a bit like running a lab, right? You start your lab, you've got this room, and you've got to be attractive to students who want to come to your lab. It's a very good analogy because it's exactly what's going on. You're sitting there, but of course it's for a different purpose, which is science. Actually, it is a very important point. Okay? And so then people are going to come in, and then you're going to be very anxious because you've got your money, you know you've got 5 or 9 years, you want to get on with it. This person's going to come in, and you're just going to be on them all the time. But that, then you've got to think right from the beginning, how am I going to set up with this person so that, what is my style? Because there's no one style, that's the thing to remember. I have my style, but everybody has other styles. You've got to develop your own style for this. There's no one way to do it. So that they both have a project that they're happy with, that's working, that you're making sure it's going in the right direction, they're doing the right thing, but also that they're having enough time to think and that you're encouraging them to talk to you. If they come back to you and say, as so often happens after, tell you back your own idea and say they had a great idea, encourage that. Don't say, oh, that was my idea, by the way. This is all too easy, and I've certainly done that occasionally, but it's, you've got to remember all the time, what is the point? What is the goal here? The goal here is not for your ego to be stoked by people in your lab. Your goal is to make a lab that has discovery. It's fine. If everyone in your lab thinks you're an idiot, and all the papers get published in Nature, that's absolutely fine as well. And that's part of the issue. When a successful postdoc leaves a lab, they should feel fed up with the person they're working with. I see that all the time with postdocs like that. They're fed up at the end because they've been doing all this work. They should be ready to have a lab on their own. They may be supervised students, whatever, and then they think this, as I said earlier, the schmuck in the office is going to talk about my data, etc., etc. Of course, so often they come back again later and say, oh, by the way, no, I realized that you weren't such a schmuck because it's quite a lot of work running a lab. And so that's because you've done the right thing. It's like, when kids leave home, they leave home because they're fed up with their mum and dad. They want to be free. They want to go off and do their own thing. They're fed up. If a kid really wants to stay at home, you've done a bad job as a parent. You have, because you haven't given them the freedom and the desire to go out and do it on their own, and the feeling, yes, I can do it on my own. I need mum and dad any longer. They're there if I need them, but I can do it on my own. And that's what you're trying to generate. And then you've done a really good job running a lab. If the person is just ready to go, they go out and do it on their own, they're not looking to you for ideas any longer. And that's one of the reasons why, people in my lab, I can say, when people try to get them to read their R01s or their next, I always refuse. It's not my job any longer. People should have the self-confidence of what they wrote on their own was their work, and that's what they're going to do. And I also hate this business of deciding who's going to work on what. People should have the freedom to go and do whatever they want and get on with it and feel self-confident they can do better than me in it. So those are the things we're trying to do then anyways. Those are the things we're trying to do anyway in running a lab, which is a creative atmosphere where you can make discoveries and make your name as a scientist. Yeah.
Where do you put the cutoff on the freedom?
Well, you see, the thing is, there's no rules. This is the thing, I can't give any answers to that. The thing is, I would say, is just to remember what the job of a PhD, what is the job of a PhD student? It's to make an original discovery and write a PhD thesis. It's not to provide data for your grant. Always come back at it. Students have been, the whole student thing has not gone in a good direction, in my opinion. We were just discussing that as old men at this LMB symposium. And when I was a young kid, it was all much better. But it was better in the following way, is there were no TAC reports or anything like that. You came in, you were given a bench, and you had to bloody get on to discover something, right? My supervisor was 2 floors down, and, it was like I could go and talk to him when I wanted. And so that's what I would say in terms of how much freedom It's the freedom the individual person needs to make a discovery. Because everyone is different. Some people come into your lab very nervous and unself-confident. They're smart and they can do it, but no one has ever told them or let them know. They've got good marks at school, but no one's ever somehow developed the creativity. And those people, well, they need to develop their creativity. Other people come to your lab and they're complete bullshitters, right? They love to be creative and talk about things. When it actually comes down to doing experiment, they can't do it. Well, those people, you have to get them, then you don't want to talk to them about creativity. You just, I'm sorry, bring me the graph. When you brought me the graph, then we can talk about the ideas. I'm not even interested. So that's do it. But as the kind of structure, maybe how you might want to think about it, which is in terms of a 3 to 4 year PhD. At the beginning, when they come in, you have to make sure the student is happy in the lab. You have to notice that they've integrated, they've got a project, they're able to come in and do experiments, and they know why they're doing those experiments. And then I think you can leave them, at least for the first year, just to mess around on their own. That's what I like to do. Pretty much hands-off in the first year, so people really get a chance to find a project they like and mess around. As you go into the second year, the screws tighten a little bit, because they've got to start thinking about doing a PhD. You've got to have a look at that sort of debris in the first year. And trying to think how you're going to sort of begin to marshal a sort of PhD thesis for them. And then the third year, obviously, you really have to start putting on, because they have to get a PhD in the end, then you really start narrowing it down to some direction and getting it out. I mean, we used to say in UCSF, the 3 steps of a student development were, first you give them an experiment and ask them to suggest controls, then you give them a system and ask them to suggest an experiment, and finally they should think of a system themselves. Those are that's an American PhD, which is a bit longer. But basically, those are the 3 steps of development. Now, so if I just come back and summarize then about what I said, is that you have a short-term goal when you come into the lab, is to have an experiment that should be published in your own lab. Maybe you'll do it with a master's student or something they had originally when they came in, just to get your name out there. Yeah.
Sorry, to follow up on that question.
Yeah.
So what you said, you leave the kind of PhD students to discover what they want to do. You got to do the same with the postdocs, right? Because they got to learn as well. But you got to deliver on your grant. If you get a grant and you want to get it renewed, you got to show that you've done something on the grant. So who's going to work then?
Well, that's the trick. That's why it's not easy, right? I mean, that's why you get better at things as you run this lab for longer. Because of course that's the trick. Like any success, they should want to work on the projects, of course, that are important to your lab. But they should want to work on them. You have to bring them to that moment that they think this is important. Not telling them, but letting them believe that that's an important aspect of the project. And so, but it's like any project. It's like, there's a really good set of, a book I recommend by E.O. Wilson called Letters to a Young Scientist, I think it's called, and been available on advice. There's a number of successful people write books on advice to young scientists, but E.O. Wilson, the guy with the ants, people know, he writes novels on ants, and he's a great scientist. And I just read a little chapter again by him. What he said is the following: as a scientist, what you're doing is you're always doing the next thing. This is what I should do, then you do the next obvious thing, and the next obvious thing. That's what it's like, right? You come in the next day and you do the next obvious thing. But you're always looking for something that steps outside it. Your eyes are always open for what is going to happen, some important thing to happen next. When Cliff came to my lab, it wasn't his plan to find the p-grams or liquids. He wanted to work on cytoplasmic flow as a hydrodynamic problem. Then you notice this, and immediately we realized we went for it. So the point is that the postdocs can be working on the next step on the project. That's what we all have to do. But your job, as I was saying, is to develop a creative atmosphere. So if they notice something important, they see the doors open, they go through it. You're not in the lab all the time to check these things. Right? You're not noticing the little things. Only the people doing experiments are noticing the little things. They come and say, this is curious. You see? Then you don't say, that's what I'm pointing to, you don't say, no, that's rubbish, carry on with your experiments. You say, that's interesting, why don't you do a little bit more work on it and have a look at it? You've done 2 things there. You've encouraged the creativity of the person, and you've given your lab a chance to do something interesting, which steps outside that either that postdoc student can do or a new one can do when they come in with some ideas for the next time. And so does that answer your question there?
Yeah.
So, that's what I was saying. Right, so we've got one other thing I wanted to go into there was there's the issue of coming in and asking, how is it? So one of the problems is, of course, how are you going to be creative yourself? So we talked about the lab, about how to generate their creativity, how to unlock the creativity of the individuals in your lab. But then you yourself have to be creative. And how are you going to do that? You've come from a bigger lab, maybe full of all sorts of great postdocs and students. You know, you come from, like Susan Alberti did, from Susan Lindquist's lab, full of some of the best young scientists in the world. You're talking all the time over coffee. Suddenly, boom, then you're in your office. And what are you going to do to generate, keep your mind creative, to generate ideas? And that's what networking is so important. So that's the other crucial thing you've got to do right from the beginning, is wherever you land, you generate your local networks. Go for lunch with people, call them up. Some in university, call them up, hey, you want to have lunch? You know, let's talk about this. And then you generate your networks of people with whom you can discuss and have creative, you know, generate creative ideas, local networks of people. And I think that's the other crucial thing that I see is not working in the lab, mistake number one, not networking, mistake number two, and not getting the security risk relationship right. You know, either at the beginning doing everything risky or doing everything secure. There's sort of two kinds of people in a way. But the thing you want to do at the beginning is you want to have that right combination of risk and safety, and you want to have the working in the lab and the networking. You've got to get out there and network with people. And also, when you go and you're looking for a job and you're going to a place, you can ask yourself, how good is the networking in the place I'm going to? When you think about where to go, that's one of the things you can always ask as a criterion for thinking about where to go. Is the networking working where I'm going? It doesn't have to be Harvard. You know, it can be any other place, but is the atmosphere good? Am I getting a good exchange here? Am I getting able to talk to people in my lab? You know, if you ask, one of the things I often like to do is a little sort of experiment when I give seminars, is you have these little schedule, and you just talk to one person, you discover what they've done, and you go to the next person, and you find out whether they knew about what the person discovered. You've just been told that. Yeah. Oh, exactly, that's quite a compliment. Let's see, so have I said one thing I wanted to say? Maybe just one thing about the long-term vision. I think John Kilmartin, when I was a student, he was a group leader in Cambridge, and he had this long-term goal to work out what the yeast filler problem was. But there were many byways along the way. He made the first antibody to tubulin. And when I watched him, I thought, you know what you have to do as a scientist? Because you've got all these byways. You've got to get this paper out. You've got to get this thing done. You're doing all these different things along the way. You've got to stay focused. In the end, it's like driving, right? You know, you can make little adjustments to not run over the old lady or whatever, but fundamentally you're keeping going down the road. Or the dog, let's say, you know, trash can. So you're keeping going down the road. And as a scientist, that's what you need to do as well, is you've got to be constantly certain about, you know, what am I interested in? Where am I going in the long term? So you can constantly ask yourself, this project, is this really helping me in my long-term goal? And that can be a secret. Right? You don't have to tell everybody about your long-term goal. Maybe even better to keep it to yourself. Because if somebody really starts to question it, sometimes they'll talk you out of it because you don't have solid enough evidence that that's the right direction to go in. Keep it to yourself. You know, that long-term goal is an important thing that belongs to you. It's a collection of all the seminars and people you've talked to over the years that gives you that vision and that direction. So you can sort of, you know, keep that to yourself as a long-term goal. But you need that long-term goal to keep yourself from drifting off and going down the wrong direction. And that's related to the other thing when you start your lab and carry on, which is you constantly have to be saying goodbye to loved projects. There's no, you cannot keep everything going. It never changes. You're a scientist, you're a group leader, you run an institute. It's always the same. You always have to make decisions about what we want to do. And you have to develop that early on in your lab. You need to develop that ruthlessness to shut down a project, even if you're getting invited to all the meetings on it, because you know enough has been done. You're the one who can see it. Perhaps one of the biggest strategic decisions I made in my lab which was something that you could look back at the time and say, how you do that was, we had done an RNAi screen, so we had more genes than anyone, new genes than anyone else. And we published a lot of papers called Gene X is required for process Y, that whole SAS4 is required for centriole assembly. And I came into the lab and I said, guys, I'm not doing any more Gene X required for process Y papers. I'm sorry, there are lots of genes, but I'm not interested in longer. There's lots of cell papers in there or whatever, but I decided that we'd done enough of that. And right now it looks like my lab may stop working on microtubules. Tony Hyman doesn't work on microtubules, but I've always worked on microtubules. I still get invited to meetings on microtubules, even though the number of papers coming on microtubules is extremely thin because you get typecast associated with a certain kind of project. But I'm just thinking now, what's left to do in microtubules? Is it really a key core subject any longer? And I don't know whether I'll do that or not, but that's the kind of thing that, I worked on kineticals for many years, and then when Arshad Desai left my lab, I said, just take the whole project. I won't work on kineticals any longer. Kim Naismith was like, that was a big mistake, that's what you're known for. But I just decided at the time that it was something that I wanted to stop doing. And I think, if I look at my career, there are many things weaknesses that I could have done better on, and strengths that have helped me. The strength has certainly been that ability to not be sentimental about projects. So just to carry on, move out of the, and leave things behind in that way.
Doesn't it depend on how much funding you have? Stopping a project and trying out entirely new project, asking the whole lab to change their projects?
Well, that's a question of tactics. So I'm not really giving a big tactics discussion now, rather strategy discussion, because it depends if you're in the United States or in India or in Germany or wherever you are. All the systems are different. You also have to play the system. Everybody is good at playing the system. I think that's what we teach people these days. But let's say you're coming to write a new grant. What do you write a grant on? You might want to write on a different subject. So therefore, in the US system, what you have to do is you have to use the previous grant to generate the money to do the experiments necessary for the next grant, the preliminary data. That's how you play the system there, as an example. And so that's one thing to decide. Because if you don't keep moving, you get miserable. You get super miserable in the end because people keep publishing papers, you're getting out-competed all the time, it's stressful, you can't go on vacation because your competitor might publish a paper on it while you're gone, or that. So keeping moving also helps you enjoy your science. And it makes sure you get the best people in your lab. Because the most interesting creative people want to work on new and interesting problems. That's why fields go downhill, because the next set of people coming in, the most truly driven creative people you're going to find are going to come to work on interesting projects, new things, and not the next phosphorylation site. That's not going to attract somebody who's creative in that sense. So you're right, you need to have a combination, and that's what I think I've been pushing since the beginning. You've got to have a combination of bread and butter projects, where you're just pushing along, and this is the beginning. I don't see any longer in my lab. I don't think I need bread and butter projects anymore because I'm successful enough. But that's a long way down the road. We can have another discussion on how to be a director later or something. That's a whole different problem.
When you make those strategic decisions, these big ones,
Yes.
do you seek advice with other scientists?
I do, of course.
But also with people in the lab, or is it just that you come to the lab and say, like, okay, we change?
Well, that happens very rarely. That's a little bit, I'm slightly exaggerating when I come and say we're going to change. I only did that once for the RNAi screen, but it's a slow evolution normally. But I rely on people in the lab to develop the change. That doesn't come from me. That comes from my discussion with the people in the lab, because they're the ones who've got the data. Then, once it's developed enough in my mind, after discussions with them, I can discuss with other people and start to think about whether that's a good strategic change or not.
Do you think about the culture of your lab when you hire people? How does that kind of, maybe you talked about how you can interact with people personally, but do you think about how people will interact with each other in the lab when you hire people?
I do, because, and in a way, that's how I set up my interview strategy, where I talk to myself, and then we spend the day in the lab, and they go out for dinner with the lab afterwards without me, and then I get feedback the next day about whether it went well or not. with a lab, you can tell pretty quickly if people are beginning to not react strongly to someone. No one ever says, I don't like that person to you. Actually, people are normally nice. Other people, I think, have a certain amount of sympathy for people come to interview. So you get the feeling about whether it's working or not from talking to people. So I think, but that's the point about culture I'm talking about. You see, is that once you develop a certain culture in your lab, that culture will tend to carry on. So that's why at the beginning, you've got to get it right. Because then you'll get people coming in who respond to the culture you like. I mean, I have a certain style in my lab. Maybe you wouldn't like that, right? Maybe you want a more disciplined culture than we have. But then you've got to have people who like that kind of working, and then other people come in and do that. I mean, but there's no difference between managing a lab and managing any organization. It's exactly the same problem, except it's much harder. It's like I remember once sitting on a ski lift with a guy, and he said, what do you do? He said, I run a lab. He said, oh, that must be terrible. He said, how do you know? And he said, oh, I work as a person who goes into companies and rescues them when they go bankrupt and restructures them and sets them up. The worst ones are software companies, and the second worst ones are biotech companies. Because people are not disciplined, they're not professional, they're too emotional. It's all an issue. So the problem that's why it's always much harder to run creative people than it is to run non-creative people, for all the reasons I talked about, because you're trying to have people creative, but you've got to keep them steered in this direction. So there's a really fine line between, getting on that.
So what do you do, especially in the junior group figure, if you get someone that's just lame and you get a shitty postdoc?
That is the most important job of a senior scientist. Unfortunately, I could have had more of that starting off, and so I'm quite happy with my junior colleagues come to see me, and I say, just fire them. Because it's very hard to fire your own person. In the beginning, okay, we can go into that a little bit, because that's a good point. At the beginning, you don't have any self-confidence about your own judgment, because you never worked with people. And if it doesn't work with someone, you tend to think it's your fault. I haven't done a proper job with this person, I haven't talked to them properly. Could be. But quite often the person is just, is not working in the lab. And so, I always help people in that. If they're disruptive or they're bad, to say, fire them, especially with technicians. There's a big problem. The interaction between a technician and a group leader is the biggest source of misery for starting group leaders. Because, you don't know how to work with a technician. Unless you've been, in a lab that you happen to work with. Mostly people have no idea. They get it all wrong. The technician gets miserable, everybody gets miserable, and then you have to say, don't keep this technician on in that situation. But also, with people in the lab, it's not a matter of firing, it's a matter of saying, what you need to do is you need to have the self-confidence to have proper discussions with people, like in a company. Germans call it Mitarbeitergespräch, where you sit there and you have a proper discussion with the employee about what you think is good and what you think is not good. And that's early on. And say, I don't think this is working for this reason, therefore I think you should look for another postdoc. It's not your fault or my fault, sorry.
How much of what you just said was it best for PhD students, or how is it different?
Well, that's very different now, because PhD students are part of the program. You don't have the same control anymore. Yeah. In many places now, more and more common. That in a way, has been taken away, and that some people say that's good or bad. Because right now, if a PhD student is unhappy, they can run to their TAC committee or their beer gift or something, and then Vilan will turn up in your office door. Complain about you have students, the leading the program is disrepute, you will be renewed next time, etc., etc., etc. There are good things about that, because in the old style, many students were treated very, very badly by their supervisors. No question about it, so I think it's better. For a PhD supervisor has to be reminded what their duty is. Their duty is to help a student make a discovery and get a paper out on that discovery. That's the duty of the PhD, not to generate data, as I said, for the papers. Not to take the graphs as soon as they come off the whatever machine and then make figures out of them themselves, but get the students to make the figures themselves to understand what it means to do discovery and to write a paper, that basic part of it. But you have to therefore do it slightly differently with a student, because you have a TAC committee you work with. But the thing to remember about it is, and this is what I always try and do, it's nobody's fault. It's not the fault of the student. The student's not too stupid. All the students coming in have been through an incredible selection procedure, the top 0.01%. It's not your fault. You're also a nice person, good at running people, you wouldn't be here as a group leader. It's the fault of the interaction. The interaction itself is not working. And therefore, it's the best for everyone to much as possible to move on. You know, the student may be better off in another lab. And so if you then sit down and think, why is this interaction not working? Often you'll solve the problem anyway, because you'll realize interaction wasn't working for this and this reason, then you can actually solve that interaction problem. I've certainly been guilty in the past of postdocs who've been too long in my lab, who I should have settled down much earlier to say, I think it's time to do it. So in other words, it's not, you just need to analyze the issue and think, you know, why is it not working, and then move them on for everybody's good.
Follow-up question. You said you have more control over the postdocs because of this program thing, and the postdocs are more experienced apparently. Then what's the advantage of employing PhD students in your lab rather than postdocs?
What's the advantage of employing PhD students? Well, let's think about that. First of all, let's talk generally about science. What do we do as scientists? Is we're really just preserving a way of thinking for the next generation. But science is a special way of thinking. We could be in a theocracy, and we're religion dominated. There's lots of other ways that we could run our societies. It doesn't have to be science driven, but it is science driven, and I think we love it for that. But what happens is a generation of people comes in, and they're trained by the previous generation to carry on the method that's been going on. If you go all the way back to the Arabs, you know, after the fall of the Roman Empire, who carried all the Greek all the way through to us. I mean, a set of people have been passing this tradition on to other people over and over again. So that's one reason you have students, because you want to carry on that, pass on that tradition to somebody else. It's a much closer relationship with students, because you're in the old Dr. Vater German sense. The postdoc has a job to become independent, go on funded job. The student has a job to get a PhD. Very different, so it's like working together. It's a very different process. So in a way, it's closer. It's closer. It's more. It can be more enjoyable because for that reason. It's like as I said, your child being successful. It's the same kind of feeling. And the third thing, of course, is although postdocs are better at what they're doing experimentally, they have more experience. They're already trammeled by the problems of experience. You know, they already have, their brains are already a little bit fixed. You know, I mean, that's what happens to all of us. And a student is completely fresh. And often students will make very creative discoveries. I look in my lab. Some students came in, and in the old days, before we got more molecular, I used to say to them, the only one thing I used to say was, look at the C. elegans embryo and find something interesting. And over again, Stefan Grill cut the spindle and showed that there were asymmetric forces. Henrik Briemann came in and showed the two cytokinesis finds. Maria Pagasa came in and found out that the Arrhenius relationship to temperature. I mean, all these are things which no postdoc probably would ever have done, because it's just relying on a certain sort of naivety and lack of understanding of just how difficult it would be. And I think that's why. And also youth. There's a nice balance of youth. The postdocs in the lab, they're getting depressed about that. They look at these happy young students, and it helps to keep the whole thing going. And you giving your postdocs a chance to think about how to work with somebody. They have to give advice to the students. And they can think about the whole lab. So basically, a sort of gradation of experiences is good for any organization. Does that mean that it's time to stop? 15:03.
Well, okay, let's thank Tony.